Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Index. So, I'm Ayaka, and we're very excited to host our neighbor Superhouse for a special conversation with Glenn Adamson and Colin Knight. So, before we begin, just a quick note: the gallery upstairs will remain open until about 8:30 this evening. So, if you want to check out the work after we talk, don't forget to go upstairs. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, please go. And with that, I'll want to give one housekeeping note. Our bathrooms are back there, and then water is free for you all to drink. If you need to exit the stairs and the elevator over there. And with that, welcome our speakers.
Hey everyone, great to see you. My name is Glenn Adamson. I'm a curator writer based in New York and London, and that is Colin Knight, guest of honor. So, Colin, I think you wanted to just start out by giving a couple of thanks. Obviously, we want to thank Stephen Marcos, first of all. He's not able to be here with us today. You might have noticed his conspicuous absence. He came down with the virus, so he's not able to be here, except very much in spirit, which I'm sure he is. But if you want to give any other acknowledgements?
Yeah, of course. Stephen of Superhouse Gallery has just been the best person to work with and just really helped make the work look the way it is. He just has such a great eye for design and for the space. And it was just such a privilege to work with Superhouse. And then thank you to Index for hosting us tonight. It's such a lovely space. And I'm really excited to talk here. And then Glenn, of course. Thank you so much for talking about the work with me. I remember one of the first times I read your work was in college about IKEA and the Marie and just the politics of furniture, and that something really clicked with me there, and it really influenced the way I make work. So it feels really special to have this full circle moment with you tonight.
Amazing. Yeah, that was an essay I wrote noticing that Enzo Mari, who was a communist, radical Italian designer, was making shelves that looked exactly like what IKEA was selling, and I thought there was something fishy about that, so I went and tried to figure it out. I'm not sure if I did, but you're good. We are going to talk about your exhibition upstairs, which is called Heroes Wreck. And I thought we might start off by just talking about that title. So obviously the title stages a kind of confrontation between two concepts, heroism and ruination. And it plunges us into the world of the Second World War, which is kind of where we're going to be conceptually and symbolically for the rest of this conversation. So can you just say first a little bit about that title, and then what we're going to do is whip through some images of the work, just in case some of you haven't had a chance to get upstairs to see it yet or want to be reminded, and then we'll broaden out the conversation from there, take 3 questions at the end, and try to do that by 8. Okay, so the title, Heroes Wreck, where did that come from?
Yeah, so basically, Heroes Wreck refers to the two characters of the show. One, Joseph Beuys, a real-life character kind of around his mythical plane crash that he kind of made work about and developed his artist identity from. And then the other character is this kind of fictional British pilot that I'm basing off of my family history. And so the heroes are those two characters, and then the wreck is kind of focusing on the plane crash of those characters. And so with Hero, I'm thinking a lot about the romantics of kind of hero identity through the viewpoint of war. And then the wreck, thinking about these kind of plane crashes as this kind of rebirth, as a tomb and womb, and thinking about planes in general. For me, they're kind of this Icarus story, this human design to do something great, to fly, but then kind of ultimately be used in these wartime settings, and its use now still feels, or planes now in contemporary sense kind of still feel like that, good and evil.
Yeah, I think that image of Icarus is an interesting. Of course, he's the ancient Greek figure who has the wax wings, flies too close to the sun, so he's a kind of representation of hubris and flying too high and thereby falling to his death. It might be worth saying a little bit about Joseph Beuys for those who are uninitiated. So Beuys, of course, is you will know as a major conceptual artist from Germany. Really defined his work in the 1960s. I would think it was the Dark Warhol. So he comes along right at that same time, and he seems to be very engaged with the question of commodity, which Warhol's involved in, but he represents it in a kind of symbolic, deep, somehow satanic way to me almost. He has this personal story, which is probably mostly true, but definitely a lot of myth making. That he crashes, he's a Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He crashes and is saved by peasants who wrap him in felt and fat. And so he makes this work that is drawing from that iconography. So that's background for Joseph Beuys, and maybe you go on to the next image, you'll see the detail of this work, which is called Rebirth for 2. And here, what we're seeing is one of the plates of on this tabletop. And this is you as the pilot.
Yeah, so these plates are kind of self-portraits of myself as these two characters, and so I'm kind of inserting myself into the story as this kind of, I think, in one way it works as like this escapism for me to kind of live this heroic journey myself, but then also as a way to kind of get closer to the characters and be able to critique them in a way.
And the straps are very interesting because, the other plate diametrically across on the tabletop is Colin as Joseph Beuys in the famous hat and vest that Beuys always wore and became kind of his visual brand. And strap, in addition to kind of holding everything down in this way that seems quite psychologically intense to me, could make you think of anything from emergency stations on an aircraft at S&M. It's quite
strong move, as we say in design, but also it cuts across your face, and so it's this moment of de-identification or anonymization. Can you say a little bit about the straps and how they fit into your
so
vision for the piece?
The kind of the tabletop was inspired by research on these kind of paratroopers and these pilots who were given these emergency kits. in the planes during the war, and especially the faces on the plates. Some pilots had these kind of fake identification photos of themselves dressed as kind of middle-class Europeans, so that way if they landed in enemy territory, they could then craft these kind of fake visas and passports to escape. And so I wanted to kind of recreate that myself in a reverse by, now I'm playing as these characters. And, the straps then kind of reverse it back and make me anonymous.
Yeah, the title of the work is Rebirth for Two, and it also makes me think about religion and specifically the sacrifice of Christ. And it's interesting that you've used the cross imagery, which could suggest, the imagery of the Air Force in the Second World War, but obviously it could also be Christian imagery. The plane itself becomes quite cross-like as well. And the idea is already present in Beuys' self-mythification. He becomes a Christ-like figure in his own mind, I think, as well as I'd say the kind of dark version, the satanic version of that.
Yeah.
Was this piece in particular about religious experience you've had or your associations with spirituality, do you think?
I think it was more so about inserting myself into the story through these two characters, but then also it's kind of a wrap up of the show. So each piece of furniture in the show represents a different point in the character's kind of heroic journey. So we've got the call to adventure, the climax of rebirth, and then this is kind of the return to the mortal world where their kind of paths have crossed and they're dining at this table. And while the stories are mirrored of each other, this is the final point where they intersect. So maybe more religious for the characters, and that it's their kind of mark of the transformation.
It makes me think of this very famous book called The Seven Basic Plots. I can't off the top of my head remember who wrote it, but it's a book about literature, and the argument is that there are only 7 plots in all of literature, and there are these typologies, one of which, of course, is the hero's quest, right? And it strikes me that although, as you're saying, this is maybe not particularly about Christianity, it shows that there's a kind of underlying structure or a shape that we might find in a religious story like that of Christ, but also we might find it in a real wartime situation.
Yeah. And then just to kind of briefly go over some of the objects in the tablescape, each one kind of connects to the character down to the utensils. So the British pilot, like his kind of butter knife is based off this rescue knife that would come in the inflatable rafts that would come in their survival kits in the planes. And then going back, you kind of see this beeswax handheld torch, and that's actually a candle, and that's kind of referring to some of Beuys' works, those survival sleds that maybe you've seen coming out of the Volkswagen bus. Yeah. The light to him was this kind of search for truth and the future, and so I thought that was a really important object, both in a usable way on the table, but then to represent, his, coming from his path and looking for the next steps. And then, it being beeswax, which is kind of one of the oldest, craft materials to humankind, used to fill rotten teeth, in medieval times. It's kind of this healing property. So each object, I think, really has a lot of, both design intention and then material history to it.
Yeah, so as you can see, there's a lot compressed in each of these works, and we are sort of starting here at the end of the story. Yeah. And in a way, there's also a non-sequential quality to the exhibition. And it's almost like a story that's been broken down into fragments and can't quite get together. At least that's how it reads to me. But maybe we could go on to the next work, just in the interest of time, and go to a different point in the story. So this is called Show Your Wound. And this is a really significant work in the exhibition, which follows on from another that I really associate with your work, Self-Portrait as a Spitfire, which we'll get to in a second. But let's start with this. So this is Show Your Wound. Can you give us a sense of what the narrative import of this piece is?
Yeah, sure. So this piece represents Beuys' survival of the plane crash, kind of that climactic moment, thinking about his unconscious body being rescued by these nomadic people in the Crimean forest where he crashed. So the kind of the large mound of this chaise sled is a casting of my body that then I've draped with leather. So here I'm kind of playing him in order to kind of get closer to the moment. But then, when the user kind of sits where the sheepskin is, you're kind of forced to confront his body and his kind of survival scenario.
So again, this idea of disidentification, so it's like Colin's hiding in here, and he actually could be inside this work. It also refers, I assume, to this very famous piece that, performance piece that Beuys did when he was invited to show in New York City. And he, you're nodding, yeah. And so he wrapped himself in a blanket and had himself brought to the gallery, put in a cage with a coyote, which to him represented America, and never unwrapped the blanket, and then got put back on the plane and left without actually having seen America, but just having been in the same, in the presence with this creature, and thereby, in some sense, devolving into a creature in his own right, sort of finding his animal self. That would be one interpretation of it. And here, similarly, we have this idea that you're hiding in a hide, and you've become this kind of cocooned beast, right? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about skin and the use of leather, which, as you'll see, is a very important leitmotif in the exhibition. What attracted you to that material, and sort of how do you feel about it, using it as much as you do?
Yeah, so it started off, I had this friend who was a cowboy boot maker and just gave me so much leather scrap, and I was trying to find out a way to use it, and I ended up kind of quilting it together on these leather panels, which there'll be some upstairs. If you haven't seen them, they're kind of these.
Let's actually go to the next image too.
Sure.
That's where
Yep, so, and this is another piece where I was trying to find a way to use these fragments of leather and kind of scrap them together. So here I've made an entire wing from a British Spitfire plane, which is a World War II fighter for England. And, this is using over, I think, like 6 cowhides that were kind of given to me, and, trying to find a way to use them, and, kind of piecing them together in a way that felt like, making a wing in real life using, sheets of aluminum. But I think leather itself has just a really, a large intensity to it as a material. It's kind of traumatic, it's the skin of an animal, and I think it's important for me to use such an intense material to talk about these works.
Yeah, when you're confronted with this work, it might make you realize what you have on your feet. It's a very deathly, and as you say, extremely intense object. And also, again, because it has a cast of your body, it has the specific idea of, as you said, a tomb or a womb, so an image of birth or death. And it's almost like you've smuggled yourself into your own work, for me, and you're in this kind of carrying capacity in relationship to yourself. I think it's also amazing here the way that you've used scale and fragmentation to give us a sense of the power and scale and size of this aircraft, and sort of welding yourself to it. So there's also something here maybe about the potency of military hardware, and by extension, and this may be a little bit more provocative, that this is an image of masculinity.
Yeah.
So here you are, like, white male dude making art, right? And this work refers back very explicitly to this moment of white male heroism, which I have to say, living in England, is still absolutely central to the British self-imagination, and they never stop talking about it, really. And yet, we also have to understand the Blitz and the Battle of Britain as this kind of horrific tragedy of loss and bloodshed and terror, right? Which is very similar, of course, to what's going on in Gaza or Ukraine, which we'll get to later on, I promise. But can I just ask you first, this work, self-portrait as a Spitfire, it's important that it's a self-portrait.
Yeah.
How did you understand masculinity, if at all, as part of the formula of this work?
Yeah, so I was making this during COVID and doing a lot of research into the Blitz in England, and kind of my grandmother's life, kind of living as an artist through the Blitz, and kind of recounting her survival stories, and at the same time trying to figure out mine, and it was hard to not feel like a hero when hearing all these kind of really amazing survival stories, and so I wanted to insert myself into, I think, her own myth, and maybe not so much dealing with masculinity, but my own identity.
Are you saying that when you were a kid, you were hearing these stories and they became a kind of projection screen for you, so you were having that fantasy of heroism that you might have watching a movie or
Yeah. I think like making this for me is a really big piece of escapism to try and relive a greater life and escape the ordinary. You know.
Although to me it also reads as a confrontation with that boyhood fantasy, because of course the fantasy image of the World War II pilot, for starters, they survive. The hero of the narrative would survive, right? That's part of the basic plot. And also there's not really a confrontation with the deathly in the way that you're providing it here. So it also seems to me in some ways that it's an indictment of the kind of self-congratulatory masculinity that we see so much of in our mass media and everywhere else. And again, this is maybe a bit of a provocative association, but it makes me think about the concept of an incel, like, you know, these celibate, isolated males that often are associated with mass violence, like school shootings, that kind of thing. And even if not that, they're involved with a lot of right-wing paranoia and conspiracy theory mongering, that kind of thing. And this idea of casting yourself literally in the role of this isolated, blinded, burrowed figure seems very poignant, but also quite pointed in relation to contemporary masculinity. Would you agree with that? Reading?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think making this, I was allowing myself to go further into that kind of hyper masculine obsession to get to a point where I then could step back and kind of critique it. And I think the work upstairs and in the show is more of a confrontation of, you know, what are these overly romanticized views of war and heroes do.
It even makes me think about the idea of the canon, you know, like things you're made to read in school. Who are you made to read? Dead white males. And here you are as one of these. So it's like you're, again, joining that community of the dead, the heroized dead, but you're also very much casting doubt on that tradition and your part in it. So it's quite complicated and ambiguous to me.
Yeah, but, you know, while being a hyper-masculine piece, you know, making it for me was also really vulnerable, you know, casting your body to where it's, you know, this curvy mass kind of laying on.
You're like an odalisque.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So a kind of sensual, maybe even sexualized image as well, perhaps. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next image. So here, on this theme of fragmentation, so we've seen the part of the plane at the wing. Here we're now kind of entering the chamber or the viewpoint of the pilot. So this is called pilot seat. And it's this sort of core sample of the plane in which your imaginary flyer, I suppose, is sitting. But also here we're getting a little bit more seriously engaged with design language, because this will of course make you think about plywood furniture like Charles and Ray Eames furniture, which of course was developed from experimentation with materials that happened during the war, famously splints, you know, carrying, what do you call them, you know, slings for carrying the wounded. And so this seems like a commentary on design as well as being a chair design, and then also this, you know, drilled core of the plane. But the thing I'd love to hear you talk about is the idea of point of view, because the way that you've placed the seat in relation to this window frame, which, you know, is almost like a picture frame, so a framing of vision itself, and then this kind of tubular attachment, really to me suggests something about like a viewfinder or a telescope, and you imagine yourself in the position of the pilot flying over the city to bomb, so the relationship between vision and violence perhaps is at stake.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this piece represents kind of the call to adventure for the characters, you know, basically the propaganda poster that brings them into the war. So this is this kind of romanticized reading chair, kind of, you know, imagining the excitement you get from being a hero, sitting in this warplane, you know, going into adventure. But in reality, it's you know, this seat that's going to crash, and there's you know, the lamp that you're reading your book under is actually a turret that's going to, you know, murder people. And when you sit in it, you're welcome to sit in it in the show upstairs, and it starts to move, and the lamp wobbles, and you see flecks in that kind of room divider that represents the exterior of the plane, and it becomes more real as you interact with it.
Can you also just explain the sheepskin on the seat? Because that's another kind of subtle reference to World War II material culture, which people might want to hear about.
Yeah, so I'm really attracted to sheepskin in a way because it's just such a material that represents survival. It's kind of, it's warmth providing characteristics. It's used in flight clothing, bomber jackets, but then also kind of tying back to artists like Beuys who are using felt, and it's kind of this material that's in the earlier cycle. It will turn into felt eventually.
It also made me think about the idea of a dreamscape, like counting sheep, and the idea of if you've ever spent any time around sheep, they're incredibly stupid and very innocent seeming. They seem kind of constantly baffled by their own surroundings, and they're very easily scared. They're obviously famously a herd animal. So the presence of the sheep in the exhibition also makes me think about a kind of commentary of the community as possibly endangered and following itself for better or worse. So there's, again, a very deep sense of registration for me in that material.
Yeah. And then, so the chair, the bucket seat, is based off a real Eames prototype. They made a couple plywood glider seats for these wooden gliders that were basically disposable one-use objects during the invasions of Eastern Europe. And the cushion is basically where the parachutes would go. So the pilots would sit on their own parachutes. So this kind of cushion and sheepskin represent this life-saving object that's built into the design. And the sheepskin throw is kind of ironic too, as this final designer's touch.
Yeah, and it refers to the kind of domesticity of as you said, the person who's having the call to adventure is reading the magazine, or the recruitment poster has been glimpsed in the tube station and is sort of imagining the world that they might enter. So it's this very kind of doubled image again, which is something you seem to specialize in. I think also the idea of sitting on your own parachute, I didn't realize that's what was going on there, but that again is very metaphorically powerful, right? Because it's like it's almost like sitting on a bomb in reverse, right? You're sitting on the thing that might save you in case of disaster, but also by that same token being constantly propped up by the prospect of disaster.
Yeah.
Should we go to the next image?
Yeah, sounds good.
So here I asked actually Colin to add this to the presentation because I think it's so incredibly beautiful, but also because it's maybe the most relevant to design history per se. So you'll immediately probably think of Noguchi and his Akari lamps, so the illuminated paper lamps. And again, it's a section of a wing, so that's where the shape comes from. But here we have you, I would say, almost as a product designer, almost as a lighting designer. Can you just talk a little bit maybe about this particular work, but also about your feelings generally about operating in a design space and sort of what you get out of it, and also what keeps you from entering it fully?
Yeah, so this piece is called Crash Fragment, and it basically represents the moments of the planes crashing in the character's story. So this is a cross-section of a wing that's kind of come off in the rubble, and making it into a hanging lamp kind of represents the energy and the importance and the radiation coming off of these objects for the characters.
Almost like it's flying through the air out of the explosion. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then also materially, it's important. It's the end caps are aluminum, a product or a material really used in World War II for the aviation components, and then the plywood ribs and the shellac both reference kind of aviation construction. But then it as a design object, I think I made it to add height to the show. Honestly, to kind of bring the work up and kind of create a whole room instead of just a floor of objects. I don't think I was thinking about it as a design object, but just more as another piece to kind of help build that world for the other objects.
Yeah, as I commented to you earlier, Colin, I'm really not a big fan of getting involved in classification struggles, like what is it, design or art? I mean, who cares? But it does seem to me like there's an important dynamic in the work that has to do with you looking carefully at design, how it's made, the structures, the particular storylines that are associated with design. The Ameses are a great example of that. Also the way the design shows up in fine art, like the sled in Beuys or the flashlight in Beuys. So could I hazard the hypothesis that you're getting a lot out of the formal rigor that we might associate with design and sort of extracting that form of intelligence and putting it into the work? Does that ring true for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really enjoy the references, and I think of my work as historical historical fiction, and then tying in these stories of real history and real design history and designers and artists kind of help make that world real for me. And if I had one goal as an artist, it would be to convince myself of my own work. And so when these stories and these worlds start to feel real, I've done my job.
That's such a great line. Convince yourself of your own work. I feel like anybody who's a maker or artist in the audience can so identify with that. And it's like a daily struggle, right? Because you were convinced yesterday, but are you today? It's always a question. Maybe let's go on to the next image. So here, this is another sort of shout out to a particular design classic, though the more recent. So this is a reference to the Campana brothers, the great Brazilian designers, and their chairs made of stuffed animals. You might have also seen the collaboration they did with Cause, Brian Donnelly, Cause. That might have run across your radar. Kim Kardashian bought one. This is part of their sort of found object interest, the Campana brothers sort of bringing together the detritus of what surrounds them in Brazil. But you've paired that soft toy language with the idea of a flotation raft.
Yeah.
So maybe talk a little about the symbolism of the work first.
Yeah, sure. So this was the hardest piece to pitch to Stephen in Superhouse. So the inspiration comes from these dolls called Rupert dolls, and basically these were fake paratrooper dummies that the Allies dropped over Normandy during D-Day to kind of confuse the Germans on which beach they would be invading, and they were these kind of 1/3 scale sized canvas and straw dummies made as little soldiers and paratroopers, and I was really attached to them as an object, and I wanted to save them, and I felt this kind of paternal duty to put them in this raft and kind of save their lives and give them life jackets. And so there's 9 dummies, and when you sit in it, you become the 10th. So that's kind of representative of the amount of air crew and the B-17 bombers, which were the most popular plane around then. And then, I also really love the Campana brothers and Brazilian design, and so you get these leather straps and this kind of leather canopy that the dolls sit on.
Also makes me think of the term decimation, which literally means killing every 10th. It's a horrific ancient practice where they would line up the enemy and they just kill every 10th person. I don't know if you were thinking about that, but that's where the word comes from. But like decimal, same root. But I think the particular emotional tone of this work is maybe worth dwelling on for a second, because the idea of the Rupert, even the name Rupert, come on, it's this kind of super dopey and kind of slapstick idea that the military came up with. It's like something out of Catch-22.
Yeah, I think it was actually a British slang, and it came from a cartoon bear that British soldiers really liked.
Kind of like teddy bear.
Yeah.
But then the way that you've worked with it, you've taken this quite comic and in a way quite childlike image and made it very poignant. Again, this idea of rescue, which seems to be a consistent theme in the show.
Yeah, and I think too, when you sit in it, you feel this kind of camaraderie, and you feel this, heroism of surviving this tragic event with other, airmen.
Yeah. Do you think that your relationship to these past figures, notably the fictional pilot that you made up, do you think of yourself as rescuing them from posterity or trying to recover them for some form of truth that otherwise would have been denied them? Soldiers, characters in novels, films, plays that might have been misportrayed. Do you feel like you're trying to reclaim them for a more aware or sensitive reading of history?
I think, it's more so about putting myself into their story than pulling them out of theirs. I've got very few stories of my grandparents' survival of the Blitz, and so I'm kind of building around those few memories I have into this kind of fictional scenes where, you know, the story of a great uncle who was an actual Spitfire pilot, you know, then blossoms into this kind of fantastical, you know, rescue myth.
So, as you said, that call to adventure, which becomes horror, there's also maybe something there about being aware of your own safety. I mean, you kind of grew up, you know, unthreatened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hearing about these stories and projecting yourself into them. So maybe some awareness of your own safety and at what price that was won for you, and a sense of gratitude, or at least a sense of awareness of that. Let's go on and look at just the last few images, and here we're getting into these leather reliefs. So first, do you mind just explaining what we're looking at here materially?
Yeah, sure. So this is basically a wooden panel with all leather, and basically I build up the leather in like a relief style. So I cut out smaller pieces and kind of stack them, and then I use glue and burnish down the leather to kind of create these kind of sculptural like reliefs. And upstairs you'll see a whole wall of them that's acting as a storyboard for the work that kind of depicts each scene of the character's story, kind of moving through. And I use these leather panels in combination with the sculptural furniture to kind of help add narrative.
Yeah, so it could be read as a storyboard for a film, or alternatively it could possibly be read as something like a graphic novel or a comic book of that time. So this idea of these snapshots within a storyline. But again, you can't really, it's like a rebus, you can't really construct it into a story, at least not in any very detailed or certain way. So it's very evasive, I think. And the fact that you have this imagery of flight and these planes that could be going out or coming back, we don't really have any sense of location for them. We don't know whether they're victorious or doomed. So there's, again, this general sense of, you use the word escapism a lot, but there's also the other reading, which is that it's not escape, but it's actually, you know, certain death, right? So the lack of groundedness and the lack of narrative structure that you're providing within what is otherwise a very formally structured viewing experience seems very important to me. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, and maybe we could look at another one of them, because I know we have a few. I wanted to ask you about the idea of the ghostly or the spectral in these works. So the fact that you're making them through this relief process of sort of burnishing the leather into this void or over a hollow, makes me think about your relationship to this past moment, which after all is now further back than most people who are living, which has only recently been the case, in fact. It makes me think about the idea of hauntology, which is a kind of modish contemporary theory term, but just in general the idea that we're haunted by past moments and unable to escape them, and continually craft narratives around ourselves, or narratives of ourselves around these traumatic events that we haven't been able to fully process. And obviously World War II would only be one of these. More recently we might think about 9/11, we might think about COVID, and the sense that we can't ultimately deal with these events, we repress them, and then they come back to haunt us in various ways that we may or may not be aware of. So obviously the cliche here would be the return of the repressed, but it might be more interesting to think of it in terms of a kind of ghostly presence that walks alongside us that we might be able to notice and sort of discern. Yeah. And I feel like so much of the energy of these works has to do with that kind of noticing and awestruck relationship to this past. And I guess I'm just wondering what your own personal idea of the ghost is, or the specter, and whether that seems like an important symbolic register for the work, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I do these panels in this work to kind of understand the past, because it's so obviously that it's repeating. And so for me, it's to understand these kind of ghosts and insert myself into these stories, and to, you know, make these kind of narratives to help understand it, and ultimately figure out how it relates to now, and what, you know, what that new work's going to look like if I make it to,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, before we open it up, let's finish with the now. So as I already foreshadowed, it's extremely difficult to look at this work and not think about the wars that are happening in 2025. Most obviously Gaza and Ukraine, although there are others, we shouldn't forget. And the safety that you felt as a child and that you're excavating and the self-interrogation seems to me so clearly a metaphor and an imaginative pathway into the condition that we're all in. And, you know, it is literally true that as we're sitting right here, right now, listening to this rather elevated conversation about an unnecessary but captivating practice, there might be people being blown apart or starving to death in these places, and it's happening right now, and we can't not be aware of it because of the pervasiveness of media representation. And although we might put it to the side of our awareness, we can't fully forget it, and we might have it inside us. That's what I was just sort of saying about trauma being processed in the body. And I wonder how much of your motivation as an artist, particularly with this show, but also in general, is about trying to give us some kind of aesthetic or ethical handle on that condition of safety in full view of tragedy.
Yeah. So, you know, Stephen and I of Superhouse debated a lot of these pieces for the show and thinking, you know, are these dangerous? Are these going to, you know, bring up ideas that we don't necessarily want? But ultimately decided to make them because it's important for this work to relate to now. You know, the survival raft with all the dummies, it looks like a boat full of, you know,
Refugees.
Yeah, refugees who, you know, are making a terrible, terrible journey.
Including to Britain, of course.
Yeah.
Another Battle of Britain, you could say.
Mm-hmm. And so I really want these pieces to kind of bring up these issues of now, and you know, it's not the final thought, but I make this work to try and kind of get closer to making an apparent statement of why it's important to bring up this history in comparison to now.
Yeah. I guess I'll just offer one last editorial comment before we take Q&A, which is that if you think about how World War II sits in our imaginations, the only reason that we're able to confront the reality of it is because of art and literature and poetry. Because if we only were depending on official representations of World War II, we would be stuck right back in that call to adventure recruitment poster, because that's all that the governments who prosecuted the war, particularly the victorious ones, would ever have told us. So it's only because of writers, artists, filmmakers, it's only because of Primo Levi, it's only because of Apocalypse Now, it's only because of Natalia Ginsburg, that we have an imaginative access to these events, to warfare. And although you might think of art and literature and film as a luxury and sort of, in some ways, as I said, a non-necessity, consider what our understanding of war would be without those disciplines and the corrective force that they've applied to official propaganda, because that is the other option. You either have art or you have propaganda, and you obviously are on the side of art.
Yeah.
So let's take some questions.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, questions. And I think if you're loud enough, we can just hear you probably. There's not so many of us. Yeah.
Question. I love how you mentioned, like, when you sit on the chair and that the objects are meant to be used. And the first piece with the table and the place settings, I know I myself, like, I instantly want to unwrap it and, like, eat off the plate. Do you see that as a useful object as well, or how does that fit into the functionalism of some of the other works?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I hope they're used, you know, fully. I want people to dine off those plates, and I think a successful piece for me is if it goes out and continues to build myth through the new owner or user's, you know, actions.
I love the idea of owning the work as an opportunity to self-mythify, which is like, it's almost like you're inviting people to play at being Joseph Beuys, and yet, I suppose in a much more self-aware 21st century way, you know, 50 years after Beuys, you know, at least. Other questions? Yeah.
That's great. It's interesting listening. There's so much imagination and research and like the intricate materializing of ideas, it feels like. And I'm
Thanks so much. I'm not a master woodworker or metalsmith by any means. You know, I use a lot of Gorilla Glue and contact cement, and I found kind of methods that allow mistakes to kind of influence the design. You know, it's hard to see these final forms with so many details right off the bat from a drawing. So I usually kind of a quick napkin drawing and then just start putting things together. And I use a lot of aluminum. It's a really great material because it just it cleans up really easy. You can weld onto it super easily. All the pieces have a lot of shellac on them, which is a great wood finish because it kind of melts into itself every time you recoat it. So I think I've guided my materials and my making methods to kind of allow improvisation. Just because with fine woodworking, it's so detail and plan oriented. It really kind of I struggled with that, especially in school, like making a nice drawer or desk.
And Colin, are you also making preparatory drawings and writing about the work as you're conceiving it?
Yeah, so when Stephen contacted me about the show about a year ago, and I would say the first 6 months were just reading and researching and drawing, and then even then the ideas kind of evolved, and then all the work was probably made within 4 months ago.
Other questions? Yeah, like that.
I'm new to your world. I appreciate what you've done, and I'm curious as to if you mentioned the fact that your youth brought you to this moment where you're able to now express the heroism that your parents instilled within you, or teased you with, inspired you by. I'm curious as to like, is this language something that you have previously done or will continue to, or is this just a one sort of moment of the perfect realization of the arc of your childhood to today?
Yeah, I think I'm continually expanding it, and each piece is another step towards ultimately making commentary about now, and I want to respond to the current events and the fascism we face in our nation every day, and I think I've got to start from the beginning. And so for me, making this work about World War II and starting with my family's kind of survival story, that's the starting point, and I'm working forward.
Do you mind if I ask, is there a question behind your question? Because you said there's a lot to unpack, and that was an awesome question, but I'm wondering what else you're wondering.
My desire was to deeply connect with his story, his journey, and also to inspire me to continue to follow his journey.
Yeah, I mean, you are young.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's very compelling to me, the idea that this is a young man's work. And I think often we don't stop to remember that. Maybe when somebody's 90, we're very inclined to say, oh, this is late work, probably. But I think when somebody's at the outset of their career, we often construct it in terms of emerging artist or, I don't know, some other kind of market construct. But I think it's very interesting to see a body of work that is about emergence from youth and the kind of traces of youth that might still be present in your artistic imagination.
Yeah, I think there are large gaps in the work, from the stuff we've seen right here. There's no direct mention of things like the Holocaust and other genocides of World War II.
Sure, right,
and it's not because I'm not interested in it, it's because I haven't gotten to it yet.
Right, okay. I had a question here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I was specifically interested in the kind of the table setting, and I was wondering if you could talk about, it wasn't clear to me, I was wondering if you have a kind of relationship to like ready-mades and versus kind of handcrafted stuff. It wasn't clear to me. It seems like some of the things on here are kind of found objects, and a lot of the later pieces are almost entirely crafted by you.
Yeah, well, so everything on here is made by me except for the ceramics, which I designed and then had a ceramicist make. That's one of the skills I have no idea of how to do. But every single object is made by me. And you know, when I was thinking about this kind of collection of objects and some of my own personal memories, like my grandmother was a large collector of just objects and trinkets through the war, and we always kind of grew up with these tablescapes of found objects, and so I think that was a subconscious result of making this kind of scattering of objects. But I also, you know, I like designing each piece. Kind of at the top is hand soap, and that's a casting that I carved of Anderson shelter, which is a ready-made British civilian bomb shelter that they would make in their backyards out of corrugated steel, something that my grandmother spent some of her childhood in. So each object, you know, whether it's apparent or not, has a lot of connection either to me or to the character. And, you know, I think the process of making each specific object is really important for me as well.
Yeah, I totally buy that, and particularly when you see them in person, you start to notice the handmadeness of it. Reminds me of Robert Gober. I'm not sure if he's somebody's.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love Gober. Yeah.
So this idea of a phrase I've run into with reference to his work is the idea of a handmade, ready-made. So in other words, this Duchampian found object that proves on closer inspection to be laboriously handcrafted. And so there's this kind of depth charge that you get out of an object like that because it's so mute, and yet it has this commitment embedded in it because of the making, and I definitely see that and feel that in your work. So it's a very observant question. Other things people are wondering? Maybe over here first. Yep.
Can you talk about the idea of healing, warmth, and comfort, and that in tension with, trauma and disaster?
Yeah, so I think I got into furniture because it was such a familiar object with me. I loved that it was accessible to everyone. You know, anyone can talk about furniture and design just because we've all sat on something. You know, my first memories of sitting on something are on a riding lawnmower at Home Depot, and I just that furniture is just such a warmth to me, and so. It really makes sense for me to just use furniture as these kind of healing objects, whether it's for me, the user, or the characters.
Well, there's also a material polarity.
Yeah.
I suppose we talked about it when we were looking at Pilot Seat, but there are materials and forms in the work that suggest comfort, and then there are like the sheepskin and the wrapping of the leather, and then there are materials and forms that suggest violence or hardness. So it's also telegraphed in that way. Yeah. Question, yeah.
I guess this is more for you, but I guess I've heard a lot of like historical ties in your work of like artists from the past that you're looking at and designers.
Yeah.
Where do you think this work situates in sort of contemporary design? Like, is it pushing against certain things that were happening or happening now, or is it, is it a part of something greater that's happening now? Or
Yeah.
what's going on now?
Thanks for asking. Yeah. So the way that I would frame this, and to some extent did in the essay that I wrote, is that, well, for starters, I think Colin's incredibly exciting. And this particular reason I find your work so exciting is that I see, for starters, in a very simple way, there's a broadening of affect and content that I see in design more generally. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the breakdown of the once very hard barrier between design and fine art practice, which again, I'm not very interested in with reference to a specific work, like what is it? But I am extremely interested in the kind of permission that's granted so many people working as practitioners of whatever kind today. So this idea of a kind of, the freedom that was granted by the generation of postmodernism, which people like Colin are now taking full advantage of. So that's kind of big picture. Within that, I'm very interested in the lineage of what I would call speculative design. So this would be the idea that I associate particularly with Gaetano Pesce originally, and this is I'm not really subjective here because I'm Gaetano Pesce's executor. He passed away last year, and I'm the executor of his estate. So I've been thinking a lot about him. But indeed, Gaetano was the first person to engage in what I would call speculative design. This is in the early 70s, where he would make up a story like that of a future archaeologist trawling through a ruin. And then he would make objects that sat inside the story. And then much later, Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby became very well known for using this speculative design practice, and they're teaching at the RCA to really trigger people's imaginations. And actually, is Constantine still here? Constantine Boym? He left. Too bad. Okay, so Constantine Boym, who is here and teaches at Pratt, he's another person I would associate with this tradition. And it is a tradition. So you have a whole strategy that's unfolded over the course of, the past 50 years. But I think it's very unusual to see speculative design cast backwards in time instead of forwards. So usually speculative design is kind of dystopian, it's related to science fiction, it's much more unconstrained in that sense. And I often find that it has a certain kind of adolescent quality because of that. Because, I'm really interested in science fiction. I just wrote a whole book about predicting the future. So I'm super into it. But I think the downside of science fiction is that whatever future scenario the writer or artist or filmmaker creates, it's always going to be an extremely thin and attenuated narrative structure and compared to reality, obviously. It's only a book or a film, right? As opposed to everything that we all experience and can never possibly account for. And what's fascinating to me about what you've done, I realize this is a long answer. What's fascinating to me about what you've done is that by taking speculative design and connecting it both to art history and to big H history, and not just any history, but the most important thing that happened in the 20th century, arguably, you've taken speculative design and almost turned it back on itself and offered an example of how much more mature and deep and sort of, as I said, haunting that set of tactics can be when it deals with actuality, even though you didn't yourself experience it.
Yeah.
And of course, as a historian, I'm very interested in that move. So there's more I could say, but that's sort of broadly how I would position it. And I haven't seen anyone, maybe I just don't know, but I haven't actually seen anyone else do that. And it just opens up such a gigantic universe of possibility, both for you individually and also just methodologically, that I can imagine a lot of other artists and designers looking at this and thinking, oh, I see that shape, and I could transplant that into my concerns, which of course is another thing you're always looking for, not just work that's good on its own terms, but work that has implications for other potential practices. Yeah, you had another question?
Yeah, and to that point, I think in further celebration of you, but I'm also curious, Colin, was there any sort of intentionality behind your choosing Superhouse, New York, to highlight, showcase, and speak to the historical elements and properties and lineage and history of your family and all the things? Because I myself, I'm fortunate enough to have traveled 35 plus countries, and I find that the American sort of mindset is that we're so fast and on to the next, we sort of forget about yesterday and how it is we got to where we are. And I find that in Europe, perhaps it's more a matter of the history and the fact that it's so deep in it, that there is more of an appreciation, I believe, with respect to furniture making and all that it encompasses. And so I'm curious if there was any intentionality behind your choosing New York as the market for this collection's launch, just sort of to broaden the conversation and deepen the love and appreciation for all that goes into your craft.
Yeah, to be honest, I wish I could say I had the choice, but Superhouse is the first gallery I worked with in my career, and I'm very lucky because it's such a great gallery in that it deals with so much history and furniture and design and just the beautiful space between art and design and usable but playful furniture. But I think it was the perfect venue for me to explore this concept.
I wish Stephen were here, but to say a little bit about why he thought Colin fit the program, because it wasn't an obvious choice, I have to say. You know, I associate Stephen for his unbelievably awesome, gutsy reclamation work of what happened in the 1980s, give or take. So very interested in that generation that was defined by Art and Industry Gallery, if people know that, Rick Kaufman, who just died in the last year. So basically the first radical design that happened in the United States, headquartered in this other gallery called Art and Industry in the late 70s and into the 80s. So this is kind of America reacting to Memphis and Studio Alchemia, other Italian radical design. And then he's also been very involved with studio furniture and studio craft, and reclaiming these people like Wendy Maruyama and Tom Lozer, who are still around but again are very associated with that time, and constructing a narrative where these things can be seen clearly in retrospect and in relation to one another. And obviously none of that is you, but it's very interesting to me, and this is a variant answer to your question, to think about the possibility that those radical strategies of the 80s, if you spooled them forward, you would end up with someone like Colin, and that therefore becomes quite a New York story, even though it's Virginia artist imaginatively projecting into Britain in the 1940s by way of a German conceptual artist. It turns out to be totally relevant to Manhattan in 2025, which is pretty amazing, right? Yeah, so there's a lot there. Maybe we'll take one last question. Yeah.
The thought occurred to me, and this really could go to either of you, but the theme that I keep coming away from is the tooling and objects of use and tools. And I'm not sure if again there's as you had mentioned a kind of double play where it's a handmade, so whether or not it's obviously you could eat off the plate. Some of these you could use the airplane wing. I don't know, but there is kind of this interesting. I just occurred to me and wanted to throw out. I don't know if that takes the conversation anywhere.
I don't know. Maybe can you say something and I'll think about my answer?
Yeah. So I guess that's why I'm here. So I think the idea of an artwork as an implement is an inherently exciting one, and one that Beuys himself was quite involved with. Of course, then the question would be, a tool for what? And it makes you think about what a tool is in the first place. And this is compounded by the fact that artworks are almost defined by their uselessness. Like, how do you know something's an artwork? Well, you can't use it for anything else. It's an end in itself. That's a concept that we often talk about in terms of artistic autonomy or self-standingness. So the idea here would be the artwork, to some extent, stands apart from the rest of reality, like a figure stands against a ground. Like if you draw a figure on a white page, the figure is the art and the white page is the ground from which it stands forth, right? So that's kind of like a Heidegger version of what art is, as opposed to a Duchampian version of what art is, which is you just take it and put it on a plinth and bang, it's an artwork. This could turn into a seminar, I realize quite swiftly, but the point I'm making is that there's a particular idea of art that is defined by its uselessness, but that then flips around to be a higher form of functionality, because the artwork encourages us to dream, imagine, critique, provoke, pick your verb of choice, in ways that nothing else can, because nothing else is freed from the ground in the same way. So that idea of artistic autonomy guarantees the artwork's ability to do something disruptive, or do something generative, or do something life-affirming in a way that any other commodity can't, even though an artwork is still a commodity. And so much of the way that we understand avant-garde practice has to do with that complex relationship between art's freedom, its autonomy, and its nature as not just any commodity, but an unregulated, wildly successful commodity in many cases. I think in terms of Colin's work, there's this, the way that I would relate that quite complicated account I just gave of artistic autonomy to what you're doing, is that there's a kind of pragmatism in your work. So a sense that you're paying a lot of attention to things that actually do function. Plane wings, tables, chairs, lamps, and in some ways you're actually providing that function literally, so we can sit, we can have illumination. And so there's a kind of reality check that's being applied almost like a kind of friction to that dream of artistic autonomy, and I'm really into that. So for me, the reason I think of craft and design is so interesting in the art space is because they're kind of taking the premise of artistic autonomy and challenging it from within in some way. And to really like get to the bottom of that, we'd need a book or like a whole, semester. But that's I would see you as part of that broader set of possibilities about design's performance in an art context. But I think you're doing it in a particularly interesting way, partly because of the restraint and seriousness and material intensity of the ways that you're using that kind of tooling. It's a great way of into the work for me.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer, and mine's more surface level. I think ultimately I make this work because I want to use it and kind of live in these worlds and be able to walk into my own museum and try on and wear and sit in the things that I'm interested in.
Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for coming. Thanks for listening so patiently, and thank you, Colin.
Thank you so much.
The exhibition is open till 8:30, and it's up on the 6th floor. So I think it's 6R,
Yep,
right?
6R.
So go on up that way, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.